Hello and welcome to Witch Please, a fortnightly podcast about the Harry Potter world. I'm Marcelle Cosman.
And I'm Hannah McGregor. And since we are talking about giggles today, Marcelle, I want you to tell me about something that has made you giggle lately in the sorting chat.
I want to tell you about these two students of mine who are so smart and so silly. They are the classic definition of silly girls, and I love them. And Neil, friend of the pod, former frequent guest, was their instructor last semester. And sometimes we'll just talk about how silly and smart they are and how they they are such a delight. I just adore them. And so while they do not themselves make me giggle, they giggle so much. And it is just a ray of sunshine in this otherwise very bleak semester. So I want to tell you about them. And I did. Oh, look, they do make me giggle. I'm giggling right now.
Yeah, they do. That immediately made me think about the student who I had the last semester that I taught before my sabbatical. I had this student who was very, very quiet and very she was consistently attending. She just really didn't talk in class. And I was doing little one-on-ones with students just to be how's the class going? Is there anything that I could be doing more or less of? And she was like, I think it would be helpful if you laughed more. The context here is that I laugh constantly in class. So she says very seriously, I think it would be helpful if you laughed more. And then she went, hee. It's incredible.
I love it. What a silly goose.
What a silly goose. I love a giggle. I love a good giggle. Too. A little tee-hee.
I make myself laugh constantly in class, and I'm pretty sure that this turns some students way off of me as an instructor. But the ones who stick around, they get it.
I have really at this point fully given up any attempt at a serious teaching persona. And now I'm just the big gay clown who's teaching your class. Publishing.
Oh, that's how Cohen walks. Do, 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 do. Sorry, now I'm just giggling about my kids.
All right, that's enough. That's enough of that.
Let's get serious.
We're getting very silly today, but before we dissolve into giggles, we should probably lay a little groundwork in revision.
Today's conversation is about laughter, but more specifically, it's about a certain kind of laughter that's coded towards certain kinds of bodies, especially feminized and disabled bodies. So let's brush up a bit on textual representations of gender and disability. We've looked at the ways in which some bodies are represented as non-normative and the ways that these texts in particular encourage us to view that non-normativity with suspicion, from the coding of Lupin's werewolfism as HIV/AIDS to the transcoding of Rita Skeeter to the fatness of the Dursleys.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, these representations have an ideological force that comes from claiming the right to decide who is and is not, quote-unquote, normal, and producing knowledge about those who are non-normative or othered. In this case, when we're talking about the Harry Potter series, narrative knowledge. And that knowledge then, in turn, reinforces the naturalness of, again, natural. Everything's in scare quotes here. The naturalness of binaries like good and bad, gay and straight, able-bodied and disabled, normal and not normal.
And recognizing the ideological force of these character representations leads to some interesting questions about the relationship between agency and ideology. That is to say, we need to distinguish between the ideological bent of the book, or the author, versus the perspective of the characters. And as we've argued many times about the Harry Potter series, what we, the reader, can see is focalized through the perspective of Harry himself, with the notable exception of like a few tiny chapters.
Yeah, like those really weird chapters where all of a sudden you're like,
whoa, I can see from the sky. Why?
I can see from the sky. That's why I was like, why are you suddenly a drone? I don't understand. But the rest of the time we're very clearly inside Harry's head.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, naturalizing the perspective of our white male protagonist as the neutral perspective is itself pretty ideologically charged as a narrative choice. We discussed that way back in our first episode on Chosen One narratives.
Oh,
remember? We were so young back then.
We were so young.
But knowing that Harry's narration is neither neutral nor fully reliable lets us ask some more specific questions about how Harry himself is describing the world around him, and of course, what he's leaving out, which is like the whole premise of Marcelle's devastating fun facts, that there's all kinds of stuff happening around the edges of these stories that we don't find out because they aren't happening to or near Harry.
And like none of them are fun, like roller skates. I don't know why I'm like this. Anyway, part of how we can question Harry's perspective is by noting places where it doesn't match up with the in-text reality. So, for example, in book 3, Harry describes Sirius as sneering at Harry's parents' death. But of course Sirius didn't. He was their best friend. And he wouldn't. That is clearly an interpretation that Harry applies to Sirius based on his incorrect belief that Sirius killed his parents. So we, the reader, were following along. We also think Sirius killed his parents. And then all of a sudden we learn otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, Harry's queer-coded descriptions of Rita Skeeter and Gilderoy Lockhart become homophobic and transphobic when it becomes clear to us that these characters are villains and that Harry was right not to trust them.
Mm-hmm. So, with this groundwork established, there's a new aspect of Harry's perspective that we are anxious to unpack. And lucky for us, we have an exciting guest who's ready to help us do just that.
Like Pandora's box. Let's open it. Theory is no laughing matter. So everyone keep a straight face as we head into Transfiguration class.
We have another thrilling guest today. Dix McDevitt, pronouns she, her, is a self-identified chancer, which sometimes leads her to magical situations like this one, and other times actively damages her career, like the time she applied to be the production manager of the Royal Court when she was 19. Dix studied English literature at Cambridge University, graduating in 2022. Dix recently graduated from the Curious School of Puppetry and is taking the first steps towards starting her interdisciplinary, radically inclusive, and queer as fuck theater company, Anything That Moves. Welcome, Dix!
Wow, welcome. Oh my God.
Hi, guys. I'm just glowing to be here. I sound sarcastic. It's because I'm English. I really mean it.
It's okay. I have enough English friends to understand that you just have to you got to get really granular to parse the emotions.
You've got to have a thick skin and just, I would say, take everything the kindest way. It just makes life nicer. I would say just, if people are trying to be sarcastic with you, take the compliment.
I mean, I will take that feedback, but you will never convince a Pisces to take things in the best possible way. That's not going to happen.
See, I'm a Libra, so I'm very good at compartmentalizing. I'm very good at switching up, seeing things from different perspectives.
I'm jealous.
So let's talk about reading laughter in a text.
Yeah. So I've dabbled before in reading laughter in novels, and I learned from trying to do it once before that you have to get specific about what it is that you're trying to do, because laughter is, in practice, very simple. We all know how to do it. It's something that pretty much, to my knowledge, happens in every culture. We learn to laugh before we learn to speak. And often we don't even know why we're laughing. Sometimes we laugh
Story of my life.
uncontrollably. But as soon as you start thinking analytically about laughter, it becomes a sort of semantic hellscape. So I thought that I would simplify the close reading to follow with a framework so that we know what it is that we're not analysing and we know what it is that we are analysing. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
That does. Yes.
Yeah, it really does.
Yes.
Hey, Marcelle, what does the word semantics mean?
Oh, fuck you. I think semantic is like the study of language and meaning. And so when you're talking about the semantics of something, you're talking about the way that the meaning is encoded in the words.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
Still, though, fuck you.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. I would have asked Dix, but too mean, so I could only direct it at you.
Man, I escaped with my life there.
Yeah. So when we're talking about the semantics of laughter, what kinds of categories are useful for us?
So, listen, the thing is that laughter essentially is quite mysterious. There have been umpteen attempts by your usual suspect, dead white men philosophers, to make it really boring and to try and pin it down theoretically. But fundamentally, as is clear from the many different schools of thought about laughter, it's not something that we can pin down with a stable cause or a stable meaning. And so obviously, what I'm about to say, there will be exceptions to it. And I'd encourage myself included to not be smart-arsy about it yet, because in terms of analysing it in a text, I think it's really helpful to distill it down to what I'm going to term laughter relationships, which is an entity that provides a stimulus and an entity that provides a laughter response to that stimulus.
Amazing.
And you know what? If you do want to be smart-arsy about it and say that you laugh at yourself, say, I laugh when I'm alone, we can still use this framework because you are the entity providing the stimulus, maybe via a thought or a memory, and then you are also the entity providing the laughter response. So it works out.
Okay.
So within the form of the novel, this laughter relationship can occur on different levels of the storytelling, which is, I think, the main aspect that gets really confusing about talking about laughter within novels.
I feel like this is one of those instances where we want to talk about diegetic and non-diegetic, and I can never remember the difference between those two things.
I have a Johnny mnemonic for remembering diegetic versus non-diegetic, which is diegetic is like dialogue. So it's happening in the thing itself. So like diegetic music in a movie is like dialogue. It exists within the world of the movie.
Okay.
Non-diegetic is the opposite. So it's not dialogue. People can't hear it. So like that's the score.
So if we take this idea of diegetic and non-diegetic and we apply it to laughter in the text, is like diegetic laughter when two characters are laughing together, and non-diegetic is when like I'm the reader and I'm laughing?
So almost,
Okay.
pretty much, yes.
Okay.
And also, by the way, I've made up this framework. Possibly other people have talked about this as well.
I love that you're the theorist.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yes, diegetic, as you said perfectly, it is within the world of the story. It is between two characters, but it's not necessarily two characters laughing together. It's just that the laughter relationship exists diegetically within the world. So the stimulus and the laughter response both happen inside of the world of the novel, or inside the world of the story. And yes, non-diegetic laughter relationships in a novel are pretty much always the reader providing the laughter response. But it can occur in a couple of different ways. So I'll just take you through the 4 that I've dreamed up. I'm sure there's more that other people can dream up.
We'll make a chart and then people can add to it.
I love a chart. So diegetic, number 1, the whole laughter relationship taking place inside the world of the novel. It doesn't matter whether the reader laughs or not. Number 2, semi-diegetic. Now that's a controversial word. I think some film buffs are going to come after me. I'm going to wake up with Neil knocking
Neil
at my door.
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
Yeah,
No.
pounding at your door.
He would never.
Yeah.
I tell you what Neil would do. He would go, well that makes a lot of sense. That's what he would say.
Matt, it's like he's here with us today. So I'm calling this one semi-diegetic. This laughter relationship is between a character within the world and the reader. The character provides a stimulus and the reader provides the laughter response. Maybe you don't laugh, but the humour relationship being set up is between the character and the reader. So to give an example of this in the Harry Potter books, my favourite one is when Harry's trying to convince Snape that his nickname is Runel Waslip.
Runel Waslip.
Which is
it's so funny.
It's so funny. And it might be the one good joke J.K. Rowling's ever written. It's genuinely, objectively hilarious.
And Snape doesn't laugh. It's not funny to him.
It's not funny to him, and it's also not funny to Harry. Harry's not trying to be funny. He's actually trying to get himself out of quite a serious bind. But the humour relationship there is because the reader has a relationship with Harry and they understand the backstory, as Harry does, of why this occurrence has taken place. So that is what we're calling semi-diegetic.
Amazing.
Are you ready for number 3?
So ready. Is it non-diegetic?
Hey, yeah, it's non-diegetic. Laughter relationship, part 1, part 1. Is that French? I've never done French. So this is between a third-person omniscient narrator and the reader. Now, as you've mentioned, Hannah, J.K. Rowling's narrative voice is erratic, to put it kindly. There's not a particular pattern set up there with really why she sometimes just drops Harry's perspective and goes in wild directions. But one chapter that we can be fairly certain, a drone chapter, it's one of the drone chapters, is the first chapter of the first book.
Yes.
We follow different characters, we see different scenes, we're not attached to anyone particularly. And so an example of this kind of laughter relationship between that style of narrative voice and the reader is the first line of the first chapter of the first book, how's it go? Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they are perfectly normal. Thank you very much. It sets up a humorous tone, but the tone is, not readable to Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. They're just living their lives. This humor is between that narrator and between the reader.
It's a joke made by the narrator at the character's expense for the reader.
Yeah, and I think actually that's a great legacy of the novel form, because you do get a lot of these third-person omniscient narrators as the novel form developed.
I feel like this is really Austenian. Austen does this a lot.
Yeah, totally.
Dickens in A Christmas Carol also, there's a lot of not that there's anything particularly dead about doornails, but yeah, it's the whole the narrator is a kind of character and so makes jokes sometimes.
Yeah, exactly that. So that's number 3. Although it doesn't occur that often in these books, I would say, just because of the fact that J.K. Rowling, maybe if she'd carried on in that vein, she could have created a stable narrative voice, but nope, it just got dropped in the bin. Number 4, non-diegetic laughter relationship, part D, between the author and reader, direct.
Okay.
How?
Obviously, we have to differentiate between the narrative voice and the author. So it's not through the prose itself or any particular voice that we encounter in the novel that is providing the stimulus. Rather, it is other more meta aspects to the work that create a wink-nudge relationship between the author and the reader. So this often shows up in terms of structure and can reveal itself humorously through devices such as dramatic irony, which can transcend the cognizance of even the narrative voice. The order in which we see things, and in plays, for example, visual gags that occur can provide humorous content. But actually, in the Harry Potter books, I think that the most common form of the author-reader laughter relationship is in puns and wordplay that are entirely, their comedic value is entirely ignored by the narrative voice and by the characters in the world. And so therefore is sort of a direct line of humor from J.K. Rowling to the reader. So, for example, the fact that the school's called Hogwarts and no one ever goes...
and nobody's like, sorry, what?
Yes.
And many other aspects, including character names, which obviously many of them are incredibly offensive and incredibly racist and incredibly just terrible, just very, very poorly done, but are also in, again, a Dickensian fashion supposed to say something about the character that is never referred to by any of the characters. I mean, Remus Lupin turns out to get bitten by a werewolf. Imagine if you called your kids Remus Lupin. and
then you're surprised that they get bitten by a werewolf. Come on.
I mean, a member of the Lupin family. So are we to assume that he is the first one to whom this tragedy is? Or does everybody in the Lupin family have some sort of wolf-related run-in, or was it just them doubling down with the first name Remus? Does he have a twin brother named Romulus who we've never met? Was Romulus eaten by wolves when he was a child and it just doesn't come up?
Because it's not part of Harry's journey.
I like to think that he changed his name after he got bitten because he's just might as well lean into it, come this far.
Remus Lupin is his drag name.
That's incredible. I love everything about the implications of that. I feel like that needs to be a whole episode in and of itself. I'm going to be writing some fan fiction about that.
Good.
So, those are the 4 laughter relationships, the main ones that I think crop up when you're thinking about laughter in novels in particular. And for us today, we're going to narrow down to diegetic laughter relationships. So the very first one, stimulus and laughter response, both occurring inside of the world. So it's not about pinpointing any aspect of the book that is intended or otherwise to make the reader laugh. Many of these things are funny in and of themselves, but actually what we're doing is we are looking at the entire exchange rather than partaking in it.
Which is useful. Like, I mean, both the sort of specificity of this terminology, but also like sometimes, as much as I love thinking about reader reaction, sometimes readers are so unbelievably, like, it's so hard to talk about what's funny to a reader because reading is such a profoundly subjective experience. But we can definitely say things about what's written in the text, which is part of why we love close reading so much.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. And that's actually perfect because that brings me on to my sort of final, the really important aspect to this close reading of the text, which is that we are not going in the vein of all the humor theorists that have come before in terms of trying to pinpoint why people laugh, what their laughter means in any kind of objective sense. That is a rabbit hole that other people can go down. I'm not enticed by it whatsoever, because in these texts, what we have is a unreliable narrator who is oftentimes himself. Sometimes he is the stimulus, but oftentimes he's actually not inside the laughter relationship in question. He is observing it and he is interpreting it and reading it and communicating it to the reader. So what we're seeing often is not just a laughter relationship. What we're seeing is Harry's perspective of a laughter relationship, which is really, really important, because the ways that he reads those relationships tell us a lot about him, and they tell us a lot about how he understands and values the other characters in the books.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm convinced.
I'm totally convinced, and I feel like I'm like really ready to dive in and look at some examples of laughter in these books.
Let's do it.
Hey, Marcelle.
Yes, Hannah?
Did you know that someone in this Zoom call is an owl in disguise?
Oh my God, who?
It's you, obviously. It's time for owls.
That was really funny, Hannah.
Thanks.
That was so funny.
Thanks. I stole that joke from my friend Bart, who sometimes listens. So, Bart, if you hear this, thanks.
All right. There are so many examples in this book series of the kinds of laughter relationships that we're not talking about that I want to talk about. And so I just want to start this section by naming that I'm going to try really hard to stay focused on the diegetic laughter relationships.
Good. And specifically, I think we're going to be narrowing in on Harry's fucking problem with giggling. What's your fucking problem, Harry?
Giggling should be made illegal is a real thing.
He says.
It's so funny. Ah.
So what's the deal, Dix, with Harry? Why does he think giggling should be made illegal?
This is the question. This is the question of all questions.
That line is like, it's a jokey line.
Yes. So I think this is a really helpful moment to put into practice what we were talking about how to get out of the quagmire of the semantics of laughing and how to focus in on just one of those relationships, because this line itself, giggling should be made illegal, Harry thought furiously. If you take the line as it is at face value, you could start going down the road of trying to think, is that a laughter relationship between the narrator and the reader? But J.K. Rowling's narrative voice is sort of like a fly that buzzes around Harry's head and can sometimes hear his thoughts. But I think, that this is a helpful example of that, because actually the way that this line is relevant to the conversation that we're having is that this is Harry's response to having witnessed a diegetic laughter relationship, which is him as the stimulus walking down the corridors, and the girls, the hydra of unnamed anonymous girls in a haze, silly girls around him who are giggling. So this is his reading of that relationship.
Okay, so because we're talking about giggling, do we want to spend some time talking about the other types of laughter that we hear so that we can kind of separate out why giggling is distinct for Harry? Like, he doesn't want to make, for example, sneering illegal.
He at no point suggests that chuckling should be a crime.
No, but even though he is the object of a significant amount of sneering, I would like to see a chart that compares the two, but that's for another time.
Yes, that is a really good point. So, I mean, I don't know if it's just me that it really jumped out, this lexicon J.K. Rowling has for descriptors for laughter. It really is very prominent to me in her writing style. These words that come up again and again: sneering, roaring, chuckling, chortling, all of these things. It's quite bizarre. And I think all of those words, as all the words ever, obviously communicate things to us. That's what words
That's
do.
what words are up to. That's their whole thing.
But I would say that there isn't a synonym for laughing or a subcategory of laughter that Harry defines with a choice of words that so clearly demarcates the way that he feels about the person enacting it. Because certainly Ron does his fair share of sneering, and certainly Harry has moments where he is sneering at other characters. He is being quite unkind. He is making contemptuous comments towards them. Does sneering even mean laughing?
Yeah. Sneering might not be like overt laughter, but it certainly is like a form of mocking alongside some of the other language you've pulled out here. So if sneering is a thing that we see both protagonists and antagonists do in the series, that suggests that it's not as stably coded as giggling is, because giggling does seem to be really stably coded. Now, when I think about giggling in this series, I think about girls. I mean, I think about book 4 especially, which is giggle-filled. I think about the attempts to ask girls out and how they're always giggling. I think about like Lavender. I guess in book 3, there's also quite a lot of giggling, isn't there? Because like Lavender and Parvati, are they the ones who are like always giggling in divination?
Now, this is interesting. It's really interesting that that's in your mind, because let me tell you, I've done some key searching of all the books, and book 3, Parvati and Lavender basically don't giggle in book 3.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
Because most of the times that we are exposed to Parvati and Lavender in book 3 is in divination. And divination...
And they're so serious.
They're serious about divination. They're not giggling during that class. You know who is giggling? Harry and Ron.
But it doesn't use the word giggling, does it?
It uses it once for Ron. In the whole series, our one hero who giggles once is Ron. He's a fit of silent giggles. In divination.
Oh my God.
But often in those divination classes, Harry and Ron are described as quote unquote stifling laughter or chortling, smirking, anything other than giggling. And Harry never describes himself as giggling throughout the entire series. Not once. Doesn't happen.
No.
That makes so much sense.
No.
Yeah.
That's wild that I remembered them as giggling.
Well, this is really interesting because they giggle so much that this suggests that even the scenes in which they are serious, we as readers have become so accustomed to them giggling that we remember them as giggling even when they're not.
Yeah, exactly. And also that actually in this book, Ron is described as giggling as much as they are. I think there's one reference to them giggling in that book, but Ron giggles once, they giggle once in that book, but we remember them as giggly. I mean, they're described as giggling in many other books a lot, so that's part of the reason. But also, I think because within that context of the divination class, it is a context that is silly. It is presented to us as a silly context. The people and the women that we are encouraged to trust, aka Hermione and McGonagall, have a lot of contempt for this subject. They dismiss it. And so it's almost like a kind of weird double negative where in that space, the people who aren't taking it seriously are the serious characters, whereas the characters who are taking it seriously are the silly characters.
Absolutely. It just really locked into my brain how all of those scenes are basically like straight white men making fun of women, particularly women of color, for liking divinatory practices. And it just made me so mad.
Yeah.
It just made me so, as I remember every time that a man has been like, ugh, do we have to talk about astrology again? And I'm like, we talk about your fake things all the time.
All the time.
Why does your fake thing need to get to be a thing that we take seriously? And my fake thing, you roll your eyes at.
You can take courses on your fake thing at university.
Thank
It's called
you.
economics.
Yes.
I listened to you talk about fucking your keto diet for half an hour. You can listen to me talk about my rising sign.
Exactly.
Ron giggles once.
Yeah.
How many other men giggle, according to your searches?
Yes, my search. Well, actually, asterisk, Ron does giggle again. I should say that this is the only time he giggles when he is of quote unquote sound mind.
Book
He giggles
5.
under the influence.
Yeah. It's when they're in the Ministry of Magic and it's not very clearly written, but he gets hit with some kind of spell and he can't stop giggling.
Okay.
In this really inappropriate setting where they're all fearing for their lives. And Harry asks, what's wrong with Ron? And the word used to describe his tone is fearfully. The fact that Ron is giggling in this situation is really sinister to Harry.
Okay.
Which, to be fair, it is a bit weird.
But as you were pointing out, he is hit with that spell from a Death Eater. So this is a curse. He's giggling due to a curse. It's a curse.
A curse and a crime.
It's a curse and a crime. And that links to something else I found, which blew my mind, which is also in book 5, when they're in St. Mungo's and Harry is reading the floor plan for the different wards in St. Mungo's. Let me read you one. It is bonkers. The ward for plant poisoning, and it just lists rashes, regurgitation, uncontrollable giggling, etc. 3rd floor.
So giggling is really linked to lack of control.
Yes, massively.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Oh my God. They describe it as a fit of giggles.
Mm-hmm.
A fit. You have a fit
Yeah.
when you're having some kind of
Yeah.
like mental health breakdown. Oh my God.
Yeah. And it is also, I would say, really, really linked with hysteria as
Yes.
well, which is in and of
Mhm.
itself an incredibly gendered phenomenon in the way that it's been used to, what's it been used to do?
Control feminized people's bodies.
Yeah, exactly. So there is this element of volatility to it, of uncontrollability. And this is a really important point, because what all of these examples dance around is that the patterns that keep occurring across the series is that Harry is associating giggling with a couple of different things, but these couple of different things, as all things do, intersect at points. So those things are a certain brand of femininity that generally is either threatening to him, or I wouldn't even say threatening, I would say illegible to him, actually.
You got a double
Double. It's something he perceives as a language between the anonymous girls around him. I mean, obviously there are a couple that he knows their names, but for the most part, he doesn't seem to know the names of any of the girls who go to Hogwarts whatsoever.
This is amazing, because the student body is like 20 people.
I know. It's entirely bizarre. I find it totally bizarre. But so he associates giggling with this brand of femininity, and also with juvenility as well. And I think already there's a massive overlap between that brand of femininity and his perception of juvenility. But also that bracket can be used to explain why, for example, Hermione, she has a penchant to giggle in the first few books, but after book 4, she doesn't so much. Whereas in book 2, Lockhart times, in book 4, Crumb times, she giggles once or twice, but she becomes serious. She gets a control over this impulse as she matures. She does giggle at Ron, actually, a few times.
But her interest in him is generally represented either as anger that Harry helps us interpret, or as a kind of like softening, like, right?
Yes.
That like he'll say something and she'll like look sort of like surprised or pleased or something, but like that giggling, excited schoolgirl crush energy is something she like grows out of.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think that in itself could be, I'm sure it's something that some fans online have written epics about. Yeah, so you have this aspect of juvenility to it as well, which is also why you have one or two instances, well, just the one actually, of Ron giggling of sound mind, but still when they're pretty young in the books, because young boys can engage in that behavior, I would argue, before a sort of romantically charged bifurcation of course, only two stable genders. I hope you got from my tone.
I enjoyed your
sarcastic that time.
bro voice. I think it's also worth noting that divination class is this like dangerously feminized space.
Yeah.
That it is like it is run by a woman. It obviously appeals more to women, but it's also like it's very womb-like. It's always very warm in there. It's draped in fabrics. It's like
there's incense. They pour tea.
It's like an aggressively feminized space that you can almost think like the giggling's almost sort of something that happens to them as a result of being in this bad lady room.
Yeah, totally.
I want to ask you guys a question because Dix, in your notes, you describe giggling as abject or as an abject kind of laughter. And so I want to talk, Hannah, could you define what the word abject means for the listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So the abject is a phrase, I believe, coined or at least theorized most explicitly by Julia Kristeva, who's a feminist sort of psychoanalyst who worked around the same time as Hélène Cixous, so sort of mid-20th century theorist. And her concept of the abject was the kind of things that our bodies do that challenge our sense of ourselves as discrete and self-contained subjects. So that as part of our sort of development into, thinking, acting, mentally functioning, because this is linked to madness, right? So a part of our development into subjects is that we sort of create these barriers around ourselves that are like, here is me and here is what's not me. But there's this problem where our bodies are constantly like leaking and oozing all of these things that aren't us and that remind us that our bodies are like not quite as stable as we would like them to be. And one of the points that Kristeva makes is that the abject is particularly affiliated with feminized bodies because like it's linked to like breast milk and menstrual blood and like the sort of particular things that feminized bodies ooze. So abjection is kind of like your body producing something disgusting in a way that like at a deeper level sort of challenges our whole concept of like autonomy and self-containedness. So abjection is often linked to madness.
Beautifully articulated, Hannah.
Thank you. So yeah, it's interesting to think about giggling as abject because it's this thing that like disgustingly emerges from women's bodies
and causes horror to the men around them.
Causes horror for Harry in particular. But it is also linked, as you have pointed out, Dix, it is also linked to like a kind of pervasive ableism through the series. So can we talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So this first became apparent to me when, after noticing how gendered giggling was, obviously then I was thinking, well, what are the instances in which characters who are men, or in Dobby's case, I guess a man.
So Dobby is a male character who giggles.
Yes, he is.
But Dobby's erratic and unstable.
Absolutely. And also as well, I would argue as well that there is a lot that codes Dobby as disabled, especially in the second book. This idea that he, left to his own devices, just harms himself, that he doesn't know what's best for him, that he is out of control, all of these things.
Right.
And that's a pattern that recurs with most of the instances in which men giggle in this series, which is that it's a marker of a perceived simplicity of mind on Harry's part. So other men who giggle within the series, I think very significantly, are Morphin, Voldemort's uncle, is described as giggling from Harry's perspective of this memory that we have of the scene. So we've got two layers of interpretation happening here, but the final one that we're given is Harry's perception, which is Morphin giggling. And Morphin is very emphatically coded as mentally disabled in some way.
For sure.
Yeah. And we also get an instance of Amicus, the Death Eater, giggles a couple of times. And I couldn't believe the way that J.K. Rowling described this line: a lumpy-looking man with an odd, lopsided leer gave a wheezy giggle.
There's so much happening in that sentence to be like, a bad man who was bad did a bad sound badly.
So here we have again the giggle representing a perceived simplicity of mind from Harry's part, and also a sinister lack of control from that character. Again, a sense of volatility, and also the fearfulness of somebody laughing in an inappropriate setting, which I would argue is something that is also coded as the behavior of somebody who is mentally disabled.
So giggling is like, it's almost always threatening, and it's consistently feminized and linked to characters coded as mentally disabled in a way that links back to the history of hysteria and the way that that mental disability and mental instability are themselves historically deeply feminized. So all of this leads me to a question, which is, does Bellatrix Lestrange giggle?
Drum roll. No, Bellatrix Lestrange doesn't giggle once in these books, which is fascinating because she embodies this trifecta. She is a girly pops. She is emphatically juvenile from Harry's perspective, but I think also she exhibits some behaviors. I mean, when she's taunting Harry after killing Sirius, she's described as using a mock baby voice, which is
so sinister.
Makes me
it's really icky.
So
it's really icky. It's really, really icky. And also is very much coded as mentally unstable. However, she doesn't ever giggle. She does other things. She shrieks, she cackles, she screams with laughter. But she doesn't giggle, which led me to start thinking about giggling in a slightly different way. Because while I agree that it is a threatening entity to Harry in the books generally, I don't think it's mortally threatening to him, either in terms of his safety, sort of physical safety against evil, or the safety of his masculinity in the romantic and sexual arena either, because fundamentally the women in his life aren't the gigglers. He likes women who are not like other girls in a really annoying way, JK.
Cho might be surrounded by girls who are giggling, but Cho herself does not giggle.
Yes. And also, when he asks Parvati to the ball, she giggles and he hates it. But when he sees her and she's all dressed up, he says that she's looking quite pretty and she's not giggling. And that's good, isn't it?
Look at that.
That is good.
So giggling is a thing that is marked as like untrustworthy and unsavory from Harry's perspective, but it's not like actively dangerous in the sense that gigglers are not serious threats or threats to Sirius.
Exactly what giggling time and time again demonstrates from Harry's perspective. What it demarcates is the characters that Harry is dismissing in some way. And he might be dismissing them because he thinks that they're bad and wrong, or he might be dismissing them just because he thinks they're silly and he doesn't think they're worth his attention and worth his time. In the case of Parvati and Lavender, who are in this, actually, I think, brings it round to how the trivial version of him dismissing these girls in his year because they're silly and they giggle a lot, actually, it comes round at the end of the books in a way that makes me so upset and so angry, which is that in the final book, we see Lavender being attacked by Fenrir Greyback, and she's lying there lifeless, and we don't find out whether she lives or not. That's not mentioned. And so
because she's not serious. She's not a serious character. She's not a serious part of Harry's world.
Exactly. But she was in Dumbledore's army. She was in his year group for 6 years. He lived with her in this space, but ultimately entirely dismissed her, to the point that if we're to take these books as we are forced to take them as Harry's journey, then whether or not Lavender Brown is dead is not an important part of his journey to him, which I think is really profound and quite upsetting.
Yeah. And a reminder of what's at stake when we have these kinds of conversations, that this brings us back to the ideological force of narrative, that something as small as a word choice like giggle versus laugh or chuckle signifies that some characters are the ones that we worry about whether they live or die, and other ones are not. And that actually, unfortunately, has real world ramifications for whose lives we think are the lives that need to be attended to and whose are not.
Absolutely.
Is it owls if we don't end on a bummer?
By which I mean...
Thank you, witches, for joining us for another episode of Witch Please. If you have questions, comments, concerns, or praise, come hang out with us at Oh Witch Please on Instagram or Twitter, and of course, on Patreon at patreon.com/ohwitchplease, where you can get all kinds of exclusive perks and follow along with our journey as we figure out what's next for the Witch Please team. Don't do social media? No worries. We have a newsletter to keep you in the loop for all of our adventures. You can sign up at our website, ohwitchplease.ca.
Dix, if people want more of you, where can they get you?
You can find me on Instagram. My handle is dixie.mcdevitt, dixie.mcdevitt. Find me on there. I'm pretty funny and I'm doing all sorts of stuff. I write things. Basically, I'm unemployed. Please give me a job.
Anybody who's got jobs to give one to Dix. Witch Please is distributed by Acast. You can find the rest of our episodes on Acast or at ohwitchplease.ca, which is, of course, expanding every day thanks to the brilliant Gabby, who we've decided has been around long enough to merit her own sound effect. And we asked her what it is, and she said that it is... You can always find transcripts and merch and sign up for our newsletter. Again, ohwitchplease.ca. It's fun. Special thanks, as always, to our executive producer, Hannah Rehack, aka Coach, to our social media manager and marketing designer, Zoe Mix, and to our sound engineer, Eric Magnus.
At the end of every episode, we shout out everyone who left us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. So you've got to review us if you want to hear me purring in your lap because I love you. Thanks this week. Thanks this week to Valerius, JKA, Hannah Lisa D, Marty Becky, Sign, GT, Lotix Cats and Owls, Ella Loves Cheesecake, God bless you, Ella, and Pick Pack Pock, or Pick Pack POC.
We'll be back next episode to add to the appendices. But until then...
Later, witches!